The rich man was in his mid-40s. His life had always been one of luxury and success. He owned a series of businesses, each thriving in the heart of the city. People looked up to him, admired him, and many sought his approval. He was used to getting what he wanted, no matter how big or small. His office was on the top floor of a skyscraper, with a view that stretched across the entire city. The floors beneath him were filled with employees who worked long hours, but he never thought twice about the effort it took to keep his empire running. To him, success was a given. Hard work had brought him here, and he believed it was all that mattered. He drove the latest cars, wore expensive suits, and dined at the best restaurants. His life was carefully crafted to reflect the wealth he had earned. Everything was organized, controlled, and predictable. He rarely took time to think about the struggles of others. The world, for him, was a place where wealth determined your worth. Yet, despite all his achievements, he was still searching for something. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but something was missing. Maybe it was the feeling that came from being in control of everything. Maybe it was the distance he kept from the realities most people faced. Either way, he hadn't noticed that his life, while perfect on the outside, was starting to feel a bit empty. The taxi driver was a man in his early 50s, worn down by years of hard work. His face showed the signs of sleepless nights and long days spent behind the wheel of his old taxi. He wasn't wealthy, nor did he have grand dreams of success. His life was a constant struggle, each day blending into the next. He worked from early mornings to late nights, picking up passengers all around the city. But despite his efforts, he could barely cover his bills. His clothes were simple, often faded from years of use, and his shoes were worn out from the miles he had walked. His taxi, an older model, was always in need of repair. He tried to keep it clean, but the interior never smelled fresh, and the upholstery was starting to tear. Still, he kept going. His family depended on him, and he couldn't stop. His wife worked too, but the money they made was never enough. They had kids to take care of, bills to pay, and a future that seemed uncertain. Despite everything, he always tried to stay positive. He'd greet each passenger with a smile, make small talk when he could, and never complained. He didn't expect much from life, but he didn't give up either. Each day was a small battle, but he fought it with the hope that things would improve someday, somehow. It was a rainy evening when the rich man found himself stuck in traffic. The streets were filled with people trying to get home, their cars barely moving through the heavy downpour. He looked out the window of his sleek, black car, irritated by the slow progress. He checked his watch. He was running late for an important meeting. His chauffeur was trying his best to navigate through the congested streets, but the weather wasn't helping. As the car inched forward, the rich man noticed something unusual. Right next to his car, a tired-looking taxi was stuck in the same traffic. The driver was hunched over the wheel, his face strained with exhaustion. The man in the taxi was older, with graying hair and deep lines on his face. His eyes looked heavy, like he hadn't slept properly in days. Every now and then, he would wipe the fog from his windshield, trying to see through the rain. But it didn't seem to help much. Their eyes met for a brief moment. The rich man didn't think much of it at first. He just assumed the driver was another tired worker, struggling through the same miserable traffic. But then something caught his attention. The taxi's engine sputtered, and the driver seemed to struggle with keeping the car moving. The rich man couldn't help but notice how worn out the taxi looked, how much the driver seemed to be struggling to keep going. For a moment, the rich man felt a strange sense of awareness. He had seen this man countless times before, but he had never truly noticed him. Now, something about this encounter felt different, but he didn't dwell on it. The rain continued to pour, and the traffic barely moved. The rich man rolled his eyes and sighed, thinking about his meeting again. But there was something about the driver that lingered in his mind. After a few more minutes of sitting in traffic, the rich man grew more impatient. His meeting was important, and he hated being late. He glanced at the taxi again. The driver still seemed stressed, his hands gripping the wheel tightly. For reasons he couldn't quite explain, the rich man suddenly felt the urge to speak to him. Maybe it was the rain, or maybe it was just the frustration of the traffic, but he rolled down his window and waved the driver's attention. The taxi driver looked over, surprised at first. He wasn't used to anyone in such a high-end car acknowledging him, especially not a businessman like the one in the sleek black vehicle. Still, he rolled down his own window. "Long day?" the rich man called out, trying to make conversation. The taxi driver let out a small sigh, wiping his brow with the back of his hand. "You could say that. Been at it for hours now, the rain doesn't help either." The rich man nodded, trying to be polite. "I can imagine. Must be tough." The taxi driver nodded again, but there was a tiredness in his eyes. "It's the same every day, just trying to make it through. You know how it is." The rich man leaned back slightly curious now. "What do you mean? Is it hard making ends meet?" The taxi driver hesitated for a moment, unsure how much he wanted to share. But something about the way the rich man asked the question seemed different than he expected. "Yeah, it's tough. Bills keep piling up. Family's doing okay, but I barely get by. Rent, food, everything just takes so much." The rich man stayed silent, the words sinking in more than he thought they would. He had heard similar stories before, of course, on the news or from employees who were struggling, but hearing it from this man, someone who had no reason to speak to him, felt different. "I don't know how you keep going," the rich man said quietly. "How do you stay so calm with everything?" The taxi driver gave a small smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "You just do. No choice. You keep going for the people who need you." The rich man didn't know what to say. His life, so different from the driver's, suddenly felt a little less certain. The rain kept falling, and the silence between them grew. As the conversation lingered, the rich man found himself thinking about the taxi driver's words. He could hear the fatigue in the driver's voice, the weight of a life spent chasing a future that felt so distant. It was strange. He had always seen people like the taxi driver as just part of the background, someone who existed to make his life easier. But now, in this small moment of shared frustration, the rich man was starting to see something different. The rich man shifted uncomfortably in his seat, the luxury of his car suddenly feeling less important. The rain was still pouring, and the traffic showed no sign of clearing up. He could feel the driver's tired eyes on him, waiting for something. Maybe a response, maybe just another wave goodbye. Without thinking, the rich man leaned out of his window. "Hey," he called out, catching the driver's attention once more. "You've been out here for a long time. I'm sure you're tired. How about this? How about I help you out for a bit?" The taxi driver raised an eyebrow. He wasn't sure he'd heard the rich man right. "What do you mean?" "I'm serious," the rich man continued, now a little more focused on his words. "I can see how hard you're working. It's not much, but maybe it'll make things a little easier for you. How much is your rent this month?" The taxi driver blinked, confused by the unexpected question. "My rent? It's about $1,200. Why?" The rich man didn't hesitate. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his checkbook. The taxi driver stared at him in disbelief, wondering if this was some kind of joke. "I'll pay your rent for the month," the rich man said, his voice steady. "No strings attached, just take it. It's the least I can do." The driver's eyes widened. He shook his head, unable to comprehend what was happening. No, I can't accept that. I don't even know you." "I know you don't, but I'm offering. Consider it a gift. You've got a family, right? You said you're struggling. Let me help." The driver hesitated, still unsure. He had spent years working without ever expecting anyone to help him. People like the rich man didn't just give away money for nothing. But there was something in the way the rich man spoke, something that made him trust the offer, even if it was hard to believe. "Are you sure?" the taxi driver asked, his voice trembling slightly. The rich man nodded. He filled out the check and handed it to the driver, who looked at it for a moment in stunned silence. It was more than enough to cover the rent. It was more than enough to make a difference. The taxi driver took the check slowly, his hands shaking. I don't know what to say," he muttered, his voice thick with emotion. The rich man smiled, though there was no pride in it. "Just do what you need to do. You've got a family to take care of. Don't worry about this." The driver couldn't stop the tears from welling up in his eyes. He had never expected something like this, not from someone who lived a life so different from his own. He nodded gratefully, still unable to fully process, what had just happened. As the rich man pulled his window back up, he felt a strange sense of peace. He had just done something that went beyond business, beyond success. It was simple. It was real. Over the next few weeks, the rich man couldn't stop thinking about the taxi driver. It wasn't just the act of giving, though that had felt different from anything he had done in a long time. It was the way it had made him feel. The sense of satisfaction, sure, but also a feeling of emptiness that lingered after the act was done. He had helped someone in need, but something about it felt unfinished, like there was more to it that he couldn't quite understand. He couldn't shake the thought of the taxi driver's eyes when he handed over that check. The disbelief, the gratitude, it had stirred something inside of him. For the first time in a long while, he found himself questioning his own life. He'd spent so many years building his wealth, focused on his businesses, his success, and his status. He had always thought that was what mattered, but now, those things seemed hollow. They felt distant, like things that didn't truly define him. He found himself thinking about his own family, his employees, the people he had worked with. They had all been part of his world, but it was a world he had kept distant, one where his wealth had always separated him from them. The rich man began to notice the difference between the life he had been living and the one he had imagined for himself when he was younger. Back then, he had wanted to be someone who made a real impact on the world, who changed lives. But somewhere along the way, he had lost that connection, replacing it with deals, contracts, and the pursuit of more. The more he thought about it, the more he realized how disconnected he had become. The city, the people, the world outside his office window, they were all just parts of a larger system. But what had it all been for? The power, the recognition? Was that really what mattered in the end? His mind drifted back to the taxi driver, and the way he had said, "You keep going for the people who need you." The rich man had always believed he was the one people needed. His business, his investments, his wealth. But now, for the first time, he was beginning to see things differently. Perhaps it wasn't about who needed him, it was about who he could help. The rich man had always been in control of his own world. But helping the taxi driver had opened a door to something larger. A feeling of purpose that wasn't tied to profits or luxury. He didn't need to be a savior, he didn't need to be admired, he just needed to be a person who made a difference in the lives of others. And so over the next few weeks he began to look for more opportunities to help. He didn't want to make grand gestures, he didn't want to be recognized, he just wanted to do things that mattered, things that would bring real change. And with every small act of kindness, he felt a little more fulfilled. The world outside seemed a little brighter, and his place in it felt a little more meaningful. The taxi driver's life began to change in ways he hadn't expected. At first, it was hard to believe that the rich man's act of kindness could have such an impact. But over the following weeks, things started to feel a little easier. The rent was paid, and for the first time in a long time, he didn't wake up each morning with the heavy weight of unpaid bills hanging over him. His wife had noticed the change too. She no longer had to worry about how they'd make ends meet for the month. They could buy groceries without counting every penny. But more than that, the taxi driver began to feel a new sense of hope. It wasn't just about the money. It was about knowing that someone, a complete stranger, had taken the time to see him, not just as a taxi driver, but as a person with struggles, with a family, with real needs. That had been the real gift. Word started to spread about the kindness the rich man had shown. It wasn't just the money that impressed people, it was the genuine care. The taxi driver's friends, his fellow drivers, even the passengers he picked up, all heard the story. And slowly, something shifted in the community. People started to look at one another with a little more kindness, a little more understanding. They began to think about what they could do for others, even in small ways. The driver's family felt the difference too. His kids were more relaxed, not worrying about whether they'd have enough for school supplies or clothes. His wife too felt a sense of relief. And for the first time in a long time, they could take an evening off together as a family. No more rushing to make up for lost time. No more silent anxiety about how to pay the bills. They had a little room to breathe. The taxi driver had been so focused on surviving, he had almost forgotten what it felt like to live. But now, with the pressure lifted, he had time to enjoy simple moments. He started taking longer breaks, talking to passengers more, sharing stories with other drivers. There was a new joy in his life, a joy that came from being able to live without the constant fear of failure. And then there was the rich man. He was still running his business, still successful, but his mindset had shifted. He began to reach out to his employees, not just as a boss, but as someone who genuinely cared about their well-being. He started volunteering at local charities, using his connections and his wealth to help create opportunities for those who were struggling. The ripple effect was visible. People who had never spoken to each other began to share kindness, and those who had felt overlooked started to feel seen. The rich man's small act of kindness had sparked something much larger, a movement of goodwill, slowly changing the fabric of the community. It wasn't about grand gestures. It wasn't about fame or recognition. It was about understanding that every person had a story, and that sometimes a simple act of kindness could shift someone's entire world. For both the taxi driver and the rich man, life had changed in ways they hadn't expected, but for the better. Months passed, and the rich man and the taxi driver found themselves crossing paths once again. This time, it was a bright morning, the rain long gone. The taxi driver was pulling up to the curb, picking up passengers as usual, but as he glanced down the street, he saw the familiar black car parked just ahead. The same car that had once been a symbol of the rich man's distant world. The rich man was standing by the car, his expression calm, but there was a warmth in his eyes that hadn't been there before. When he saw the taxi driver, he smiled and walked over to him. "Hey," the rich man said, his voice softer than it had been months ago. "How are you doing?" The taxi driver smiled back, his eyes bright with gratitude. "Better. Much better. You know, it's funny. I didn't think one small thing could change so much, but here I am, living a little easier." The rich man nodded, taking a deep breath. "I know what you mean. I feel like I'm living differently too. Helping you that day, it's made me rethink everything I've been doing." They stood there for a moment, silently understanding what the other was feeling. Both men, so different in so many ways, had found a common thread, a deeper understanding of what truly mattered. No words were needed to express the gratitude they felt. The rich man had started to understand that real wealth wasn't about what you had, it was about what you gave. And the taxi driver, though still working hard every day, had rediscovered the joy of living, knowing that kindness could change lives.